started here. Appreciate everybody that's joined us here. First one we've done in a little bit while. Mark, I appreciate you joining us here for this. What you have here is a group of leadership facilitators and people who are passionate about leadership that we just kind of like to continue to hone ourselves and get a little bit better. And we did that through reading, and we just all really enjoyed your book.
Absolutely.
So just as a process check here, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of have our normal conversation that we normally do for about the first half an hour or so. Just talk either about just what you thought of it. There are maybe a little bit focus on chapters 7 and 8, which I think are the ones that are most pertinent to what we're doing. And then in the second half, we'll get an opportunity, get some feedback from Mark, and then be able to interact and ask some questions and stuff with him, and kind of have that open for everybody. So I like the way that Tom usually starts these out and just say, well, what did you guys think of the book overall? Tom, you want to go first? I know you had a lot of.
All right, I'll go first. Yeah, I really liked it. I've already posted a couple of page screenshots on my Facebook, and I think that for me, I think that he did well, I guess he's here, so it's weird. Mark did a great job. Starting off with like this, you think of the heart versus the brain, and give me a little, I'm going to give you a warm up, about that it is the heart. But the big takeaway for me was around the connection, because your heart is this emotional part of you. And it's like, we talk about that with Life's Compass Rose. We talk about leadership being a one-on-one sport. If, when we give our course, we say, if you have 30 people working for you, you need 30 motivation plans. If you have 10 people working for you, you need 10 motivation plans. And that's the first thing. The second thing I started thinking about is that I've mistakenly moved away from coaching, right? We always talk about the difference between a status meeting or weekly check-ins with the monthly or quarterly. Let's just talk about you. And I had to laugh when he was telling a story in the book, because I invited a woman to coffee, and this is going back 25 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And she just happened to be the first guinea pig. And she's like, why does Tom want to have coffee? Why am I doing coffee? What is the coffee about? What's going on? And I hadn't properly told people, hey, I just want to get to know everyone better. I'm going to start inviting you all to coffee. So by the time she met me for coffee, she thought she was being fired, because I'd never asked anybody to coffee before. So that's it. I think there were a lot of places, whether it's the personal leadership philosophy pieces in there where you're talking about being transparent about how you're going to lead. But my key takeaways were, man, you do have to have that emotional one-on-one connection, and you have to love the people that you're leading. Like, do you really love your people? And that was big. And then second was, I've gotten away from coaching, and I think that we need to really hammer that as we close out our 3-day programs to say, this has to be nothing about the business, nothing about this project or that event, none of that. It's all about what are you doing? Are you getting the resources am I giving you what you need to be successful? What are your personal and professional goals? And am I giving you the right resources for that? Because that's what coaching is about. It's not about asking about project X or the timeline on project Y. Mark, I really did enjoy the book. I'm a den leader in the Scouts. And I had a great relationship with my dad. And without getting too emotional, that part of the book I found very disturbing, because we all deserve better. And to have a dad that was so successful and had grit and determination, and have him flip to the dark side of that and seeing everything as a competition, including against his own son, that was heartbreaking. If this is Lead from the Heart, man, that part of that book was really heartbreaking to me. And I think those of us that do have good relationships with our parents and loving homes, we sometimes discount the upbringing that others got or didn't get. So appreciate you sharing that story and laying it out there bare for everyone to see. And it really touched me personally.
Thank you. Can I respond, or do
yes.
you?
Yeah, please go ahead.
There's just so much in there to respond to. I'll tell you, the backstory is that you remember, was it Stephen Covey that talked about the lid? Who was it that talked about, you guys should know this, the lid that we have on ourselves, or our limitations of how far we can go, kind of a thing. We tend to put the lid on ourselves much lower than what we should. Is anybody relating to this? Well, based on the way that I grew up.
That's Brian Tracy.
Was it Brian Tracy?
I think so. It might be Covey. You might be right.
In any event, you get the idea, right? So I've been really successful in my whole career and sort of transcended the whole upbringing and sort of, like surprised myself in many respects. And then when I started to write the book, all his voices came back. You're not a writer. You're never going to be able to do this. Other people do that. That's not who you are. And so it was a real struggle. And there were many days where I was like, I can't do this. Like, I'm not going to be able to do this. And I had a friend who is sort of a super clairvoyant. I don't know. I describe her as someone not from this planet because she just has this understanding of humanity that I don't really understand. But she said to me, she goes, "You're going to have to tell your story in your book." And I was like, no way, no how. And she goes, not only that, but you're going to have to do it now. Like, I'm sensing like you need to start writing it. It's going to be the preface of your book. That's what people are going to relate to. That's what they're going to understand. And I said, there's no way I can do that. I know this will be ridiculously painful for me. And she goes, I'm just telling you, that's what your book is. So I went to the UCSD library. It was really weird, but I graduated from there, and I've taken a million more classes there, spent so many hours in this library. And I went one day up to the top where the literature section was, where I spent so much time in college. And I found this office with this magnificent view that I'd never seen before. And I thought, oh, this is a great omen. This is going to be a great setup. So I walk into the room, I sit down, and I just have a legal pad and a pen, and I think, okay, I'm just going to start to write this out. And honestly, I thought it was going to kill me. It was so incredibly painful to write that whole preface. I seriously didn't think I could get through it. But what ended up happening when I did get through it was that it had a great impact on actually healing me. And then I realized why she told me I needed to do it, because I can't tell you the number of people who didn't have your life experience, Tom. People come up to me after I speak and they go, I just want to tell you, I had the same experience. And I know it wasn't the same, but a lot of people have really shitty childhoods, or what they think is a really shitty upbringing. And I think that's a powerful insight for every leader to have, is that, and the same woman that told me this also gave me another insight, which is that most people, most adults are operating most of the time out of their childhood selves. So if you had those experiences and you didn't heal them, they're still influencing you. So you see people behave in weird ways and you're like, why do they behave like that? Because it's some emotional trigger from some experience and you're playing into that somehow. You're doing something their mom did or their dad did or what have you. And so this is why it was helpful for me to heal that. So just a couple of other things. I want to tell you that coaching is the way you described it is brilliant, because so often we get caught up in, okay, so Tom, I want to do some coaching with you today, but before we do, where are you on this project and where are you on this one, and right? And it's game over, right? And we get seduced into that and we think, oh, we'll do the coaching later. Let's talk about work, and then we never get to the coaching. And what we know is that regardless of positions, even if you're changing beds in a hotel, that's your job, that people want to grow. And it's one of the greatest drivers of engagement. So if you can demonstrate to people that you want to take time and teach them what you know and share what you've learned and offer coaching to them in terms of observations in an unthreatening, psychologically safe way, you're going to have people so grateful to you. And then the last part is that connection. When you think about what's going on right now with COVID, that's what people are missing more than anything. Like, they can't hug people. They, many cases, we're seeing their families, and we're all missing touch. We're all missing being with people. And so the only alternative is to double down on having that connection where you just pick up the phone or regularly schedule it and say, this is just time for me to get to know how you're doing, what's going on in your life, what are the challenges, how can I help you, and be authentic in that and really listen. So I appreciate all the things you took from the book, but I wanted to make sure that I kind of added in on that because you really had a great insight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to have it turn into a pity party, but I was dead last. Basketball, baseball, kickball. We played a game called punch ball, and I did not enjoy reading that part of the book either. Right, like just because I was the kid that they look in your eye, and as you described it, they would look like, can I just grab any other person off the street versus having Tom on my team, and it scars you. And you can either make you stronger or crush your self-confidence. But man, not being the last kid picked in those Sandlot games is rough. Now I laugh. I say I was the worst player in the sport in history. But anyway, Michael, I'll turn it over to you. Good book, Mark. It really, we read a lot of books on leadership, and this was a great read. Good stories, good science. I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you.
Yes, Michael, what were your thoughts?
Well, I'll tell you, as I was reading this, it actually kind of took me to a different place, and I was thinking about an E2L engagement I had years ago with the police association here in Austin, and looking at the profiles and talking a bit about coaching and the way you engage people. It was very hard for that group to express their heart. Reading this book, it gave me new words to kind of think about that experience. But they said, we're not touchy-feely people. Maybe they are, but they've developed this armor as policemen that doesn't let them kind of lower it and show their heart, even to the officers that work for them. They have to have this tough, macho attitude. So Mark, it really came back to me as a question as I was reading your book is, how do you communicate these lessons, these very important lessons that you put in your book, to people like that? Well, it's a year and a shield.
It's a fantastic question, and you're going to be surprised by, first of all, you're going to be surprised by my answer, but how's that working for them? Right? I mean, if you look at how the police as a industry or a job family or whatever you want to describe them, I mean, they're not ranking very high in terms of how they execute their jobs right now, right? Sure. And so so you actually, and by the way, if I could just speak to it, shooting somebody 8 times in the back is not a heart kind of a thing, right? So, and with all the publicity over all the previous ones, you would think that there would be some, let's back off on this. Maybe that's not the first thing that we do, and so I agree with you. So, but I think you're right. It's because the whole macho thing, we think that's what our job is. Our job is to be the tough guy and, push people around and get them to behave, and they're thugs anyway. And so that's what they deserve. And that's not working for any of us. So about 3 years ago, a guy reached out to me, a former policeman, and he said, I'm using your book with policemen. And he goes, we're teaching them heart. And it's called Blue Courage. That's the name of the program.
Wow.
And he reached out to Simon Sinek before he reached out to me, or I would have invested in it, because it's like, it almost made me cry to hear what he was doing with these guys. But he's basically going from city to city and bringing these guys in and getting them to access their heart. He's doing really remarkable jobs. And he introduced me to, this is just us chickens talking, right? So he had me go speak to the top management of the Homeland Security Department, and they're all military. They're all former police, all military. That's the common denominator, and it's a leadership academy. but there's no heart in the group. And it was one of the most painful experiences for me, because people were looking over their shoulder like, am I supposed to believe this guy? Because I think they wanted to, but they've been, they're long in the tooth. The people that are running this leadership academy have been in police work or, some sort of military, for their whole careers. And now this is a second career. And so, when I left, I just said, you guys, if you're managing all these people that are making $10 an hour, and you can't convince them that this is meaningful work and that the country cares about what they do, because they're taking so much crap from all the people going in there. It's like, speed up the line, and do you really need to look at my shampoo? And they're just taking all this, and no one is an offset because they look at it like a machine. So your insight is spot on. I'm just grateful to know that there's at least one guy out there that's trying to correct it.
Very nice.
All right, Michael, why don't you pick on somebody next?
Okay, how about Jim?
This is a reunion of a sort. So it's nice to see you, Mark.
You too, Jim.
And, I think I reviewed this book in 2016, and you were my second podcast or Jointcast. In fact, I've taken the liberty of coloring outside of the lines, and I think I've shared it with you, Mark, the 2-minute clip from our interview. And your book struck me. I was thunderstruck when I read your book for a couple reasons. One is, you can tell talking to this group, right? We're service academy graduates, largely engineering backgrounds. There's a lot of classical left brain in our group, and we speak a lot amongst ourselves in those terms. I don't think we're quite Neanderthal, but there's clearly a right brain part of you, and I put it, I stated it in our interview, and I put it in my book review. I believe that chapter 4 isn't just the heart of your book. I think it's the soul of your book. And it just crushed me when I encountered that. First of all, I was shocked someone referenced Gary Zukav, because I never tell anyone that I've read Gary Zukav, because it's such it's a completely vulnerable statement. And I read Zukav in my 20s because he tied quantum physics to Eastern philosophy. And that's who you are to me. You're the one who bridges those two. So you got the credibility of coming from financial services. You dig in the big stuff. So that, and I really appreciate what you said about the COVID remarks, particularly this year. I was asked by a ladies military networking group to come up with a talk for this year. I wasn't looking to do that, and I found myself addressing that same issue. Where do we, how do we deal with the fact that we've been sent home and we've lost our sense of purpose? It's not a surprise that when the cadets at the Air Force Academy who stayed, the seniors stayed, everyone else was sent home, and within 2 weeks they were killing themselves a couple months away from graduation. So there's some real sober stuff there. So the part that I'm really curious about with the book, and I'd like to hear a little bit more, is the stuff in chapter 4, for instance, the references about the Heart Math Institute. That's moving into right brain territory. It was a bold reference you put there. The vagus nerve, the actual physical tie, the heart's ability to detect. The idea that there's actually a brain or a neural system in the heart has not escaped me. Again, that's where it struck me so deeply. I'm curious how much that body of work has grown or gained traction since you wrote the book. That's the primary thing I'm curious about. And the other thing I'm a little bit curious about is, since you're such an expert on tracking Gallup trends for engagement, at the time you wrote the book, what it was like 30 years of a flat line. I've read some stuff in the last couple of years that there's an uptick, and I'd like you to comment on that also.
Okay, so let me start with that, and then we'll come back to the hard stuff because this is, there's so many synchronistic events in my life, but one day I just had this idea of reaching out to Gallup and seeing if I could perhaps write an article about engagement. And this was when I had just interviewed, the book had just been finished, but I had already gotten the information from the conference board, which was in the book. And I thought maybe Gallup has more information. And for whatever reason, I ended up meeting with Jim Harder. And in the process, Jim goes, well, we're just about to launch like this major American workplace study in the next few days. And so he gave me the evidence. And this was probably now, probably 7 years ago. And he let me be the first one in the world to announce that engagement is horrible all over the world with, I think the number at the time was like 30% of Americans expressed that they were engaged in their work. And so I just wrote a new article with Jim a month or so ago. And he's been on my podcast a couple of times, so I'm really current on it. The number right now is about 35%. So it has gone up. And each percent represents 1 million plus people. But when you're still looking at the percentage, and I got Jim to agree to this, if you're still looking at only 35%, there really hasn't been all that much improvement. And so it's been a huge validation for me because until we change how we lead, we're not going to get a different response. I'm convinced. So changing the way that I'm talking about is also like an uphill kind of a thing because like you were talking about engineering as being very left brain. So everybody has a bias and a disposition. When we think about who's in management, we're hiring people to get performance and results. We're not hiring them to nurture, to support, to care, to educate, right? That's not what we're looking for. And so until we change that and say, you're going to have to get performance by cultivating the well-being of people. Until we do that, we're really not going to see an uptick in the numbers. I really believe that. So does that help that in terms of where we are today?
Sure. I thought it was something like that, but I figured if anyone was watching the trend, it would be you.
Yeah, I'm very much paying attention to it. And, and it's kind of moving a little bit radically right now, simply because we're in an unusual situation where people are working from home and they're still measuring this. And I think that you sort of have to throw out that data until we all go back to whatever life is going to be post-COVID, because whatever we're doing right now isn't real. So if people are happier, it's probably because they don't have a commute. I just read people average $2,000 in savings now since COVID started in commutes. So people are like financially better off and they're at home and they're being able to spend more time with their kids. So you can see that there'd be an uptick in happiness, but I don't know that that's sustainable in terms of how we're really managing people.
I was always fascinated by the actively disengaged statistic, right? 18% are actively disengaged. I'm like, what does that look like? And we talk about the Pareto principle as well, that, your high payoff activities and your best performers are going to deliver, 40, your top 10% of performers are going to give you 40% of your productivity. Yeah, those are horrible, horrible numbers.
Well, I mean, you think about what is it that would make somebody be that angry that they want to retaliate towards their organization? And so an example of this is, and this is sort of like a paradox to me because this is an organization that is so unbelievably successful and yet has a horrible reputation for how they treat their people, and that's Amazon. And so it got leaked out yesterday that they were looking for somebody like the head of espionage so that they could pay attention to these warehouse workers and what they're posting on Facebook and, like really, really dark kind of stuff, And so it's like, why don't you just pay them a little more and treat them a little bit better? You won't have to go through all of that. But Jeff Bezos, for as much of a genius as he is, I had somebody on my podcast who worked for him for many years, and I slipped in a question. I said, what's one thing that Jeff Bezos is a genius for, knowing he could pick a million things? And then I said, well, what's one thing that Jeff Bezos isn't brilliant at? And he goes, he doesn't know how to treat people well. And so, you know, that infects their whole organization. And so you can imagine those warehouse workers that, you know, you've seen stories where they're forced to pee into bottles and they're monitored all the time. And they have this constant reminder, if you don't get the next item in 10 seconds, you're going to get an electric shock. And I'm exaggerating, but, you know, it's pressure, 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 pressure. And there's not a whole lot of good that comes from it. So they have massive turnover and they just treat people like robots. And I just think that's like a huge flaw in the way that
Steve Jobs had that same reputation, right? That he was just a massive jerk and had no interpersonal skills.
But
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on that because I worked closely with Apple in the 90s because of joint ventures between IBM and Apple, and worked with a lot of managers who worked either directly or just a couple levels down from Jobs. And you know, what's interesting is some of them ended up leaving Apple because of Steve Jobs's style of leadership. It was very harsh. He would criticize people very, very roughly in terms of his approach. I mean, I even recall a meeting where we went out to Apple and we're in the middle of a major engineering review, and he came in and literally ripped us a new, you know what, just because, you know, he beat on IBM and Motorola, who were his suppliers at the time, just to kind of make a point. And even though we weren't the people responsible for pricing or anything else, he took the opportunity nonetheless. But what kind of disturbed me as time went on is when I first started doing this leadership development, I did kind of relate some of my experience first and second hand about Steve Jobs as a leadership story. And I stopped doing that because, interestingly, the younger generation worships him. And I even had people who said, I'm going to start a company, I'm going to act just like Steve Jobs, because they saw the success that Apple achieved. They actually felt that that was the way to model their behavior, to be tough, to be, you know, overbearing on people in terms of what you expect. And so I stopped using the story because people saw him as an example to follow rather than as, I saw him as somebody who could have been so much more successful so much sooner if he had actually exhibited a heart in his style of leadership.
after he got fired, apparently he went to India and learned meditation, and he actually came back and said, you know, one of the things that I learned in my experience over there is that in America, we're just all about our brains, and in India, they're about the heart and intuition. And so if you read his biography, Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, and I also had a woman named Kim Scott, whose book you might have read, Radical Candor. She was on my podcast, and she created the training program at Apple, so the leadership training program there and management training program. And so it was a great opportunity. I said, you know, basically what I've heard is that he was two different people. So when he came back the second time, and this may be, I mean, we create folklore about people, and look what he's created. I mean, it's astonishing what this company has done. And so people, you know, misappropriate that his style was the reason that that company, he was also massively creative, unbelievably creative. And
Sure.
right, so he's sort of like a one-off, one-of-a-kind kind of a person. So anybody who applies his style of management version 1 is going to be met with a lot of resistance and probably doesn't get a lift-off. But the version 2, apparently he became a much, he could still be a dick to people. I mean, but he wasn't as much. He had a great, he still pushed people and challenged people because he understood that that was the way to get people's excellence. Don't accept their first, you know, their first version. Just keep challenging them until they come up with something great, and we're all the beneficiaries of that. But apparently he became a softer guy in his second round. So if you hear that story, make sure that, you know, people are telling you that, say version 1 Steve Jobs or version 2 Steve Jobs,
Exactly
because
right.
the first time you don't want to be that guy, you know. So let me get back to Jim's other question about the heart. One of the interesting things is I started the podcast because I thought, you know, when people hear this language, lead from the heart, it's just an automatic killer. It's an automatic, this guy doesn't get business. I think I explained this in the book, but, you know, soft and weak and sentimental, and who would ever bring heart into leadership. And so I kind of had this uphill battle. So I started writing all these articles thinking I would just drip on people. And then I thought, okay, maybe people need to hear me, like realize that, like, I get business and I know how to drive performance and it's not woo woo. And so in the process, I have been, you know, curating. Like, I'm looking for people whose work is helping to validate this thesis, to give more than I had when I wrote the book. And so Roland McCready, who's been one of their co-founders at HeartMath, he's been on my podcast, Jim, and he can give you, you can, if you want to listen into that, we talk about what more they have discovered. But to pinpoint it, what I would say is that the more they research it, the more certain they are of it. But what's also interesting, in the last probably 10 years or so ago, but particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, there's a movement called positive psychology, and you've probably read some of the positive psychology books in your group as well. But there are two people, Sigal Barsaid, who was one of my most recent podcast guests. She's a psychologist at Wharton Business School, and Barbara Fredrickson, who is a positive psychology star, like celebrated star, University of North Carolina. And they have looked at it from a different point of view, which is the emotion side. So what they have been able to demonstrate isn't so much about the heart, it's about the impact of when people feel positive emotions, what's the experience of it. And so this is hugely validating, because one of the conclusions that they both make is that we are feeling, sensing people, and that we are hardwired to thrive when we experience a greater balance of positive emotions. So when you think about engagement, the reason that people are not thriving is because they're experiencing so many bad, negative emotions. And so there's a researcher at the University of Washington who proved that, I think his name is John Gottman, and he proved that any relationships, he's a marriage expert, and he proved that when husband and wife, spouses have a relationship where there's 5 positive emotions to every negative, they can count them on being a very successful marriage. And when the numbers start to decline, that's when things go really sideways. So what we're finding is that we really need managers to take that role of creating a culture, an environment where people are working well together. They're not competing against each other, feeling a threat from each other. They're feeling emotionally and psychologically safe by being with their boss, because they're feeling appreciated, they're getting coaching. All of these things translate into positive emotions, which I thought I was like stepping out on a limb when I wrote that, but now there's just like so much validation for this. So, I was always certain that I was right and that the world would come to me, but now I'm like really certain, like, what are people waiting for, And it's because I've had the benefit of having 51 conversations with extraordinary people doing some kind of research that inherently has validated this. So I hope that answers it, Jim.
No, we have an exercise that we go through during our 3-day course, and it's called Life's Compass Rose, and it's where you go and explore how people feel about the different aspects of their life, and it's like, and you get people to take a step back and go like, would I be comfortable having these conversations with people? But like, I say to folks, but that's what connection means. Like, the names of their kid, that their dog was at the vet over the weekend with this, and that they've always wanted to be a guitar player in a rock band, and that they play, at a local pub on the weekends. Like, you don't just know what their skill sets are and what they're contributing to the to the company. And I think that's the heart, right? And then, you know, the connection that you make is like, by the way, they're going to outperform now because they're connected to you, you're connected to them, and you know what makes them tick, and it enables you to motivate them and create the conditions for them to be successful. So it's like, that's part of the messages in the book as well. It's like, this isn't just touchy-feely stuff. This will get you better results. This leading from the heart.
It's misunderstood as touchy-feely, you know, and whoever came up with the language of soft skills, it's not, these are hard things for people to learn because we have to unlearn what we've always, you know, always been taught. But this idea of, you know, knowing that they, you know, play a band on the weekends, we think, well, that's sort of like a waste of time. I don't need to be talking to people about that. But when you go, hey, how did your band play this weekend? What you're really saying is, you matter to me and I want to know what's going on with you. And when people feel that you matter, then when you go in and you go, hey, could you stay late tonight to get this done for me? They're not going to go, this is somebody that just is demanding, and never gives a shit about me or cares about me. All he cares about is getting his work done. And that's when people retreat. And so it's not manipulation if it's authentic. But people will say, you know what? And there's also something else that I've learned since the book came out. A fantastic book for you guys to read is called Influence by Robert Cialdini. It's C-I-A-L-D-I-N-I. He's at Arizona State University. And so he talks about all the different ways that we're influenced. But one of the things that he says is that we human beings have been formed to be motivated by reciprocity. So I'll give you an example. So Tom, I live next door to you, and my wife makes, you know, more brownies than either one of us can eat. So I come over with a plate of brownies and I go, hey, Tom, we can't eat all these. So I know you love brownies, so I want to give these to you. So he says, what's your first reaction? Be honest. And so when I've asked this question before, people go, oh, thank you so much. That was so kind. And he goes, that's not the first reaction. The first reaction is, shit, I got to give him something now. Like, you want to,
what do I owe you now?
You know, right? And so what, you know, and so it's like, hey, you know, hey, come on in and, you know, I want a beer or whatever. And it's like a hot potato, the way he describes it. It's like, I got to do something now because I don't want this hanging over my head kind of a thing. So what he said was, if you go back, very simplistically, giving a very simple understanding of what he was talking about. If you go back to caveman days, if I had a piece of meat and you didn't have a piece of meat, I would give you a piece of meat, but there was an expectation that as soon as you got some meat yourself, you'd give me meat. This is how we looked out for each other. And so he goes, that's how it plays out with brownies. So when you, Tom, using your example, say, hey, Bill, you know, before we get into talking about work, how was your band this weekend? Did you have a big crowd? Like, did you play well? What'd you play? Did you play your own music? Did you play covers? You know, what killed? Tell me about it. Now you've made this investment in them and they're like, man, Tom really is interested in this. And of course they're going to go, it was fantastic. And you have to allow them to tell you that story instead of go, okay, well, I've heard enough. I got to get on with the, where are you on the project kind of a thing. If you kill the joy, then you kill the effect. But the ultimate effect is that when people are in this moment of doing work, they're like, I want to do something for Tom because he's so thoughtful. He's so appreciative. He knows that he knows what I do on Saturday nights. That matters to me. And so I want to reciprocate. And so when you're not even in the room, when you're not even, you know, even in the same city, people are working hard to reciprocate to you because of how you treated them. This is why everything that I'm talking about is not soft and it's not touchy-feely. It has a direct effect on behavior. And if people understood this, they take more time to go, tell me about what kind of a beer did you drink? You know, tell me more about the story before we get on to it. I'll tell you.
Mark, let me sneak in here, Mark, because I wanna pass my baton off to Andy.
Your turn, Andy. Let us know. You got to unmute yourself here.
Like right now. I
Yep.
thought you were getting ready to say something.
I didn't see you until now, Andy.
Sorry about the shadows, guys. I mean, the sunset, I didn't realize all my light was coming from one side. So I got to get some lights to do this from. See, half my face is dark.
Well, as a submariner, you ought to be going red by now.
You just need a big bald head like I got, and then it
illuminates.
Yeah.
It's self-illuminating, right? Yeah.
I got that. You don't have that problem. But yeah,
I was grateful for the
any
shadow.
questions that you might have for Mark?
Well, it's a great discussion, Mark. Thank you for sharing a story about your dad. I mean, we all have our scars. I don't know that anybody, I've known a few people that claim they had the perfect upbringing. I wasn't really sure they were telling me the truth, you know? But most of us have had something, you more than most, but it gives me a lot of insight. I didn't think about it. There's a young man I know from church that's now joined our Toastmaster group who comes from the inner city of Cincinnati. So he comes from an urban background. I mean, and it's way different than out where we live, you know, the more middle class. And he's fighting some demons in his life for sure, right? And it didn't really, well, I mean, it occurred to me, but just that story alone makes me appreciate even more how tough it is to get rid of those demons. And yet, your story, you know, about the V1 and V2 of Steve Jobs, I mean, it gives you hope. You can get rid of the demons, right? I mean, it's kind of interesting. For those of you that are Christian, of course, everybody talks about you get a fresh start, you know? That's what being born again is really supposed to be all about. It's not just walking down to the podium on a Sunday or something. It's like, no, you just put all that stuff, put it in a box and throw it away. That's over. You get a fresh start. And that's what it's all about. But sometimes easier said than done, right? I mean, to really put it in a box, that's what, but you know, you got to really be willing to throw the box away too. So it's a little tough. You know what, the thing that got me a little bit, you were talking about the cops. And I don't know that many cops. My daughter was married to one for a while. So I got an insight into his life. They're divorced now, right? So that didn't, and they were in their 30s. They both made some mistakes, but just talking to him over the time I did that kind of made me appreciate you know, you're talking about they have to put on that armor, that macho thing. Well, the environment we put them in, right? They see the worst side of life every flippin' day. Every day. I mean, it was crazy talking to him. It was like, I talk about, oh, you know, this neighborhood is pretty nice. Like, oh no, we arrest people all there all the time. You still have nothing, get over there. You know, I mean, they don't get to see the nice side of life that often. And I think that toughens them up. And in a way, I think it mirrors, my daughter's a nurse. She's an emergency room nurse. So and the daughter was married to him. Well, she's got armor too, right? Because every day people come in, their bodies are just shredded, you know? And, you know, some of them are going to die pretty quickly. And so she has to have armor more than I do. I mean, she can't form an attachment to people that only got a half an hour to live or something, right? So it's sort of both versions of how do you adapt to that environment you live in? You know, on his, it's seeing the worst side of human nature. On hers, it was the worst side of you know, physical health or whatever, if you want to call it, right?
The difference is, though, that I would argue that your daughter went into an occupation that almost demands you have a caring nature. You know, nurses aren't robots. You know, they are caring. Now, they may have armor to protect themselves from getting caught up in, you know, an emotional, you know, mess when they see somebody dying, right? But in terms of their day-to-day orientation, most nurses that I've ever met are really deeply caring people.
Right.
You know, Whereas when we hire policemen, we're not really looking for that. We're looking for the bravado. And actually, who applies for those positions, right? So you almost like, I'm attracted to that job because that's who I am. So, you know, I get that a lot of them see a lot of really bad stuff, but not all of them see a lot of bad stuff every day.
Yeah, and you're right. And I've actually read some autobiographies written by cops who kind of come to the real, or at least the one I'm thinking of the most, came to the realization that from a, in some respects, they were the same as the criminals. There's just one was on one side of the law, was on, but they were both adrenaline junkie kind of people, action oriented, into things, yada yada yada. And sometimes that line would get a little blurry, you know, and all that.
But where the heart comes in is it allows you to solve some of those problems. Not all of them, right? Somebody's got a gun on you, then you got to do the same thing. But
well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, there's 600,000 odd cops, I think, you know, between local police and FBI guys or whatever, right? All these different cops, and you do hear, you know, you were just saying, you know, cops aren't really well thought of. Well, that's all a 60-day issue, right?
that's current. That's what I'm talking about.
Up until 60 days ago, you know, you'd hear the good stories about cops too, right? The ones that found a homeless woman on the side of the road and pulled money out of their own pocket to buy him a pair of shoes or to buy a kid a meal or something, right? There's those kinds among the 600,000.
There are, so I don't want to be misunderstood on that.
Yeah, and you know, and so then you said maybe you shouldn't shoot somebody 7 times in the back the first thing you do, and I'm like, well, that's bullshit. That's not what happened, right? I mean, I haven't been in a fight outside of, you know, a planned fight, you know, martial arts sparring, since I was in the 7th grade, right? These people are trying to take their heads off every day. And that's what happened in that case specifically, right? They'd already been in a fight, and the guy's reaching for a knife. So, I mean, you know, I'm willing to cut him a little slack there and not say you got a heart of stone, you know?
How about we table that one and we
Yeah,
on what we do for our leadership development. Maybe Andy will let you pass off to, we got 3 more people here still to go. You pass it off to one of the others and let them give their thought on the book.
The other thing I'll just throw out there, the Jobs thing and how tough he was, makes me think of another guy in my life, Rickover, right? Same thing, right? I mean, the guy was brutal. Jobs was brutal. They got amazing things done, transformative things. And then I was sitting there in my mind, just as we were thinking about this, trying to think of an example of somebody that got a transformative thing done that we would say had a huge heart. And I was coming up blank. So I'll throw that out. Help me out here.
What's a transformative thing?
Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, political role. I mean, sure.
Eisenhower, Overlord, leading the Free World armies into Europe, where he writes the message on June 5th saying, hey, we made the beaches, we took and it was because of the sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines who did it. And another version saying, hey, everything was screwed up. They did everything right. It was all on me.
Jack Welch?
Well, I'm sorry, who, Tom?
Jack Welch, GE?
Oh, I've heard my Jack Welch
more the Jobs version.
I worked for GE during the Jack Welch era. I've heard stories. I don't know.
I think he's more the Jobs version 1 from what I've heard.
Yeah. There's an element of that for sure.
How about
Right?
Winston Churchill?
Yeah, we're talking about military and political leaders. And in my mind, I don't mean to get
Not Tony Shea.
Lee Iacocca?
Maybe Lee Iacocca, maybe.
Oh, wait, I got one, guys. I got one. Sam Walmart. Sam Walton.
Mm-hmm.
Brian
Right.
Mullally.
I'm trying to remember the fellow who was head of the stock exchange on 9/11.
Warren Buffett.
No, not Warren. That's,
I'm saying I'm throwing.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
All right,
Andy.
we got some candidates.
Pick somebody else. I think we got Ryan, Scott, and myself. So go ahead and throw that
Well,
to somebody else.
Mark, I'll take it. Mark, thank you very much. Good book. I've enjoyed it. I had just finished the Radical Candor by Kim Scott just before I started yours. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition, but they work well together. And I enjoyed it. I'm enjoying this talk. And just like Jobs has his cheerleaders and supporters, Patton is one of ours in the military where people loved him and loved to hate him. So, but for the right people, he had a lot of heart. So it's not a real clear cut to me scenario, but I'll defer and let Scott or Kim take it. And thank you much.
Mark,
Let me say that when Kim Scott was on my podcast, I asked her directly, why did you have to call it radical candor? Like, why did it need to be radical? And she said, after reading your book, I wish I'd called it compassionate candor. And I thought that was really interesting, but also the business world loves the word radical. So radical candor has this wide appeal, but in terms of how she's actually applying it, she leaned much more into the compassionate side of things, which I thought was really kind of interesting.
right, and then Dempsey named his book Radical Inclusion.
Yeah. Well, I think radical is a nice word for the Silicon Valley crowd, but my leadership philosophy that I published 3-4 years ago, personal values, compassionate candor, telling the truth and being honest. That's number. It's helped me, and I liked your book. It's good. It's given me a lot to think about and some other stuff to look into and get smarter on. So
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much.
Just one quick comment based on what I've been listening to. It doesn't seem that we see much in the press or in books that really highlights people with the kind of characteristics with heart that have been super successful. And it seems like we need more of that. I mean, in your research,
but we do. We see it every year with the best places to work, and the local business journals do that at the city level, and then Fortune, which you mentioned throughout your book, Mark, has been doing it since the mid '80s, and those best places to work outperform everyone in terms of performance. But it's like that. I had a number of people that come to work for my company, and they said they found us on the best places to work list. And to make that list, they give every employee a satisfaction survey, including like, would you recommend a relative to work there? Yeah, and so it's a twist on an engagement survey, but is your company a good place with a good culture? And so we do celebrate those companies at a local level. But what we don't do is say, well, that was because of
I'd like to see
Jobs. That was because of whoever it is. We don't peel back the onion to find out what makes it great to work. But Andy, I think that's a great question. Like, who is it? Can we pick 10 people to celebrate?
I'd like to be the people, the leader, the CEO that's the example, that sets the example for the whole company, as opposed to the company. You're right, Tom. But who are the examples of the true leaders at the top that have set that hard example and done things well?
Two that come to mind, one that I wrote about in the book is Jim Goodnight, who's the founder of SAS. And they've had 42 straight years of record revenue. And I've been there. After the book came out, I went and met with him and wrote an article for Fast Company. And it's everything. It's lead from the heart on steroids. And they have, I think they're an industry with 22% turnover, and theirs is like 4%. They have thousands more applicants than they can ever even interview because people want to work there. And they're not the highest paying, but they just do so much to care for their people, including the coaching that we were talking about earlier. But you read about the perks and those kinds of things. They mean those for conveniences. But there's another one, Gary Ridge, who's the CEO of WD-40. Is all about the heart. And if you're interested, he was also on my podcast, and he talks about how, they only have it's a big name. We all use their products, but it's not a huge company, but it's international. And he said, what I figured out was that when we use the product, like if, you know, your daughter comes up and says, Daddy, you know, I want to take the training wheels off, and you can't get the bolts off because they're rusted, the kid's crying and you want to be the hero, and you take the WD-40 and you spray it, and now all of a sudden the nut comes off, the training wheels comes off, the child is happy, and what's your experience with WD-40? It's like, this is the greatest thing in the world, right? Thank you for this. And he goes, that's what we're after. And he says, but what we also need to be doing is thinking that these are our lives. Like, I'm working with these people all day long. We should have the same relationship. So he calls it a tribe. He literally has a TP in the office when you walk in as a reminder that we're all family, and it works. And they have one of the highest engagements of any organization in the country. So those are two that are like legitimate, you know, doing everything that we're talking about and doing it well. Jack Welch, by the way, was Neutron Jack. Remember, he would fire, his methodology was the same that they did at Microsoft, where they stack ranked everyone so they're competing.
And yeah, the bottom 5% every year got let go. Yeah.
Yep. And there's studies that have come out since that show that people were going through divorces, had health issues, you know, something was going wrong, and that the very next year they rebounded. So if you hadn't let them go, they would have been great performers the next year. But he was so caught up in, we got to be weeding, and then it created this internal competition where people didn't support each other, they didn't collaborate, they were actually sabotaging each other, you know, shredding their work and making sure that things didn't get communicated because they were being ranked in relationship to people. It was horrible. Afterwards, when he created his MBA program and had a little teeth lengthening, he said, you know, I totally regret that aspect of my management, because leadership, as one of you gentlemen said, is all about trust and relationships and connection. And you can't do that if people are feeling threatened that, you know, one bad day and I'm going to be out the door. So he's talking Boston too.
It was kind of odd working for GE. I was there the first 3 years after I got out of the Navy. You know, it was that transitional thing. And they were kind of on this precipice of going from the old paternalistic kind of company, which was the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever. And I'd be interested in your view of the difference, articulating the difference between the paternalism of that era and the you know, what we're describing as the heart kind of thing, where we really care about people, but I don't necessarily think we're talking about paternalism. But anyway, they were transitioning from that to this Jack Welch, Neutron Jack, all this kind of stuff. And then the rest of my career through the 90s and 2000s and everything, you'd run into these guys that came out of GE. And GE had this reputation, because they had Crotonville, of having the best management training thing. And, you know, companies would hire the managers from GE because they were so good. Every one of them I ever worked with, worked for me was an asshole.
Yes.
That school of thought, it was all numbers. There was no heart in that school at all.
I'll retract my Jack Welch vote. I was just trying to grab
You're
some
nodding,
names.
Mark. I mean,
it was a good challenge, because that's what Mark's talking about. It's like, how do we celebrate those people that have heart and get results?
Yeah.
And you know, I think that's why everyone's so crestfallen with Ellen or Oprah when they peel back the onion, and the people that worked with them or for them are like, you don't know what a holy terror they were, but when the camera was on, they were on. So yeah, I'll retract my Jack vote.
Well, as a group, we ought to think about it and come up with names and people that we can start using in our training if we want to reflect Mark's book in our training.
I think what happened is that we went into coincidental to Jack Welch's ascendance at GE. We got into this short-termism thinking around shareholder returns and sort of let all stakeholders go. So you had, by the way, I just read this and I never knew this before, but Harvard and Wharton were established basically to teach business managers Taylorism. So,
yeah.
Right? So that's how,
right?
They said, you know, we want you to go out and teach these guys how to manage this way, right? So we take we just took all the heart out of it. Yes. So Jack Welch comes in and he's trying to make a name for himself. And by the way, I don't know if that I wrote this, but my father was an executive vice president, 42 years with General Electric. So I have some understanding of this from, my own experience. And they were sort of a, provincial, caring, paternalistic is the word I think one of you used, it's organization. But they were also like one of the biggest innovators on the planet. We had every new appliance in our house and it was always GE brings things to life. And so this was a great company. And then you had this, we got to return every quarter to shareholders. And Jack Welch just knew how to play that. He just created an environment. And so what I think he was very successful at doing early on was creating he just reeled in the slack, if you will. He sort of blended the paternalistic with the demanding. But then he went all demanding. And that's when you got to Crotonville, by the way, the company that I spent most of my career, we had a bunch of GE people. And, every time I heard, oh, this executive, he's coming in from GE, and I'm like, he's going to be another asshole, because I know that's what they breed there, So I know.
Same experience. Yeah.
That was the culture. It was cut, either you're really competitive and you're competing against people, and that's just not sustainable. It's just simply not sustainable. Yeah. So it's, and I think people misinterpret my message and think it's all about the heart. And if you go, I just say business is all about the mind, like GE. It's all about smartest people, the most demanding. Don't get caught up in people's messiness. And that doesn't work. But if you go to all heart and all you're doing is caring about people and you're not holding people accountable, well, that doesn't work either. So it has to be that blend. And I think that's what people are realizing.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll give you a chance there.
Scott, have you had a chance to share your thoughts on the book overall?
Not yet.
I have not. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Mark, first I put it in the and everybody, I put it in the group chat as I began reading the book. The Art of Demotivation came to mind, and The Art of Demotivation is now about 15 years old. I gave you a YouTube clip there too on addressing employee complaints and the "it could be worse" solution as a cost-effective way to manage that. And I've used The Art of Demotivation, some of those film clips. It's satire, it's sarcasm, so it actually shows you the things that you shouldn't do, and you're using the negative example to go ahead and be a teaching point there. But a lot of what you put forward made me think about that as something that, okay, there's a connection there. What really struck me though is, and I'll call it the contrast between the time, and I did a full 30-year military career. But as I came into the Army, when I came in, the values of the Army that were being instilled were commitment, competence, candor, courage, and very quickly by about 1984, 1985, caring was added as a fifth C to that. And one of the things that is pointed to, and now you've got the ideals and then you've got kind of the accepted norms within organizations, and an infantry battalion can be very different than an armor battalion, can be very different from, and depending upon the infantry battalion, it'll take on the character of its commander. But Schofield's definition of discipline, hands for all who remember, kind of at least paraphrase Schofield's definition of discipline, okay, which and Schofield's definition of discipline is a ponderous 19th century way to get to the point of it's about heart, and you need to lead with heart. But the other thing that came to mind was also Sun Tzu's quote, "Regard your soldiers as your children, and they'll follow you into the deepest valleys. Look on them as your own beloved sons, and they'll stand by you unto death." And those were kind of the touchstones for this is what leadership's about, as I was brought up in it, and the infantry expression of that would be, you've got to be a hard ass because the mission has to be accomplished, but you don't have to be an asshole.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so what I found very interesting though is how you framed it as it's more important now to go ahead and answer up to that desire, that need of human beings for that connection, and to connect with their soul. Esprit de corps is the word that comes to mind, but to connect, because the hours that we're putting in are so much longer, and all of those other social supports and connections and community, the whole bowling alone idea, all of those things have withered away. And so you've presented it as now leaders have an additional level of complexity and an additional task that they have to take on to go ahead and get the best out of their team by leading with heart, where in the past, it was perhaps possible for people to get those needs satisfied, those connections linked in in other venues, and that some of that's withered away, which led me to think, well, yeah, better leadership's one solution at work, but do we need to really kind of do that life's compass rose as a society and step back and say, are we doing this right?
I mean, what you just said is brilliant. And by the way, that quote that you just read could be, the whole description of everything that I believe in. I also believe that the military caught on to this a lot earlier than business has, largely because it's a brotherhood and you're going into battle and you better have each other's back. So that leans you into heart. I also think that COVID is forcing people, loneliness is becoming a huge problem for all of us.
Yes.
And so my son has 1-year-old twins, and one of them was born with a breathing problem. And so she's been on oxygen until literally today, where they just announced that she no longer needs it, which is a huge thing for us. But in this past year, now we have COVID. So guess what? The parents we're not seeing anybody, including you, Dad, including you, Mom. And it's been brutal, to watch these kids on Skype, Zoom, to see them go from little babies. And just, from February to August, the growth has been astonishing. And so, when I think about that, I think about it from an empathetic point of view. We're not seeing our colleagues. We're not, as much fun as it is to be working in our pajamas or sweatpants or whatever, and the comfort of not having to drive places. There's something about being in a meeting with people and throwing around ideas and talking to people afterwards in the halls that we're not getting. And that's connection. And
Right.
So by virtue of not having it, it might get us back into the bowling alleys and teams. It might get us back into churches. It might get us back into something that's going to create social connection beyond work. There's going to be impacts from this whole thing that we can't even imagine. Right now we're seeing the destruction of Starbucks, and where McDonald's isn't selling breakfast and foods anymore because people aren't getting in their cars and going. And so you see that, but then there's every action has an opposite equal reaction. Well, what's the other side of this is that I think people are like, when I go back to work, I'm going to be kinder to the people I work with because I miss them. And when I'm as a manager, I'm going to be kinder to people because I miss them, and the only time I have to talk to them is over Skype or Zoom or whatever. So it's influencing our behaviors. And so I think it's been a seesaw. You have Taylorism, you have the Jack Welches of the world, you have the Jim Goodnights and the Gary Ridges, and they're coming together. I really do believe that. But ultimately, I think, if I can just say this, I think if you're going to go 50-50 mind heart, I'd say go 51 heart. Lean a little more into the heart. That's what
a little extra balance on there, huh?
That's
Ken, why don't you share us your thoughts and key takeaways from the book? You were
Absolutely.
kind enough to go last.
Yep, it's okay. I don't mind going last. So here was my take on this. So when I summarize leadership, and my last thing I talk about in my LECs is my little wrap up, is I talk about my 3 questions. And it's 3 questions that every person subconsciously asks themselves about their leaders. Number 1, are they competent? Number 2, do they care about me? And number 3, do I trust them? And those really line up really nicely with our 3 pillars of, know your people, know yourself, and know your stuff. But when I get to that, do they care about me aspect of it, that is 100% what we're talking about heart. That's all about the heart. My first platoon sergeant, he was a hardcore man. He said, "Hey, sir, you can't train the heart. Like, if their heart's not there, there's nothing that you can do to train their heart. They either really care or they don't. They can only change themselves, but you can't train them to care more." So that's what, this, when I looked at this, I liked it. Now, I've been very critical in a lot of the books we've read because I don't like books that are just tell you what you should do, but don't tell you how to do it. Now, Mark, what I really enjoyed about your book is that you gave a nice little background about why this is important. But then in your next, 5 through 8, when you're talking about, hire with heart, connect with the heart, maximize the potential, empower the heart, and inspire the heart, you really gave leaders a way of what to do and how to do it, not just, hey, here's some good general knowledge. And I really respect and appreciate when authors really, when I can walk away with something and say, okay, I can behave differently because these are the things that this particular person has shared with me. So that was my key takeaway that I got the most out of it, is that, yeah, there's some really practical things that a leader can implement, and you give a roadmap for leaders to implement some of these things. And to me, that was the most valuable thing, and what I think that we as an organization, when we're helping other organizations out there, especially the connect on a personal level and maximize employee potential, that heart to heart and empower the heart, those are what we as facilitators need to be really focusing on for our clients, is how do we help them do that better. And I appreciate how your book kind of gives some really good insights on that. And I was just wondering, is there kind of anything that, like, other ideas that you had that didn't make the cut because you were limited on space, or other ideas that aren't in the book that maybe, you could share as well along those 2 lines?
Well, what I'll say is that you can teach heart. Not to everybody. Not to everybody. And so, interestingly, if you're consulting with a company in an interview, and you convince them that their managers need to lead more from the heart, it starts by fundamentally changing their model for who they hire going forward for manager roles, all manager roles, unless they're managing facilities. If you're managing something other than people, it doesn't really matter, right? But if you're managing other human beings, you have to be caring. If you can't be persuaded that the person that you're interviewing for management roles cares enough about the success and growth and well-being of another person as much as you care about your own, then you should never put them into management. That is the first step. Because now, every time you're bringing in a new manager, you're seeding it with people who are already wired that way, right? The second step is to say, we need to communicate that this is important, because it hasn't been important. So we've not been all about the heart. So if we want more heart, we have to tell people what it is, explain why, tell them what the behaviors look like, and then reinforce it through recognition and, making sure people get, hey, look what Bill did, look what Tom did, look what Mary just did. This is a perfect example of what we're looking for, and you celebrate that, and you ultimately create the culture that you're looking for. On the other hand, this is something that I learned afterwards from Jim Harter at Gallup. I'm almost interested in posing it as a question, but I'll just put it out there. They believe that 2/3 of people in management roles have no right being a manager of other people. And the reason is, and this is my language, but it aligns to what their science shows, there's a caring gene. It's like, you either have it or you don't. So, like, there are plenty of people that are very content going to work, just thinking about their own money, their own rewards, their own success. Salespeople, typically. This is why salespeople don't always make good sales managers, because when you make them a manager, they're still thinking about their own recognition. They're thinking about where they rank. They think about how they're growing and whether they're getting recognition, all the things that motivated them to be a great salesperson. And so the notion is that if 2/3 of, by the way, this lines up perfectly when you think that there's only 30% of the country that's engaged and only 33% of people that are wired to care about people, it sort of like mathematically plays out, right?
And 60% of the managers are going to fail in their job as a manager.
Well, but they don't.
But that's a Gallup study as well, that only 33% or 34, only 34% of Americans want to manage other people.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean the other 2/3 aren't valuable. And I was working with a client that the only way you could get promoted was to a leadership position. And I was like, that's not okay, because some people don't want to lead.
But not only that, I mean, it's such a great insight. You've got to tell them they've got to create like a VP of sales position for their top salesperson, so they don't put them in there because they're going to do harm to people because they're not wired to be a good manager. They need to have, what happens is you go, well, you're such a great salesperson, Tom, we're going to make you the sales manager. And we think that's the natural progression, but that's not necessarily. Some people just like selling. But if you give them the title and say you're now a VP of sales or some title that means something in the organization, we don't want you to go into management. We want you to keep doing this, but we're going to give you more perks. We're going to give you, more rewards, more title, something that is equivalent to what they think is the management role. Because you're absolutely right. We have to hold back. I'll give you a perfect example of this. Does anybody know who Bruce Bochy is? So Bruce Bochy.
You're talking about the baseball manager. Yes.
So he played for the San Diego Padres. Now, San Diego Padres are suddenly looking like a pretty great team, but for my 40 years of following this team, they've been the worst. And in the late 70s and early 1980s, Bruce Bochy was a backup catcher for the San Diego Padres. Played 9 years. He wasn't even the starting catcher for one of the worst teams, right? What?
You're still muted, Tom.
Oh,
he has a huge head.
Oh, I don't get that.
No, he literally physically. The running joke with him is his helmet.
Yes, physically. So here's a guy who hit lifetime batting average 227. He hit 27 home runs in 9 years. So what is that?
3 a year.
No, right? So this is not a home run hitter. This isn't the starting catcher. He's playing on a really crummy team. But the Padres, somebody in their ownership, saw his influence, and it's probably why he played for 9 years with such mediocre results. He was something of a force on the bench. He helped other players. He made sure when the new guys came on the team that they felt welcome. He taught people. He was just very generous. He encouraged people. He brought people together in teams, and they talk about the game, what they were going to be doing. So the Padres had nothing to lose by naming this guy their manager. And what does he do? He took them to their second World Series. They went in '84, but in 1998, they went to the World Series. They got killed by the Yankees in 4 straight games, one of the greatest Yankee teams of all time. And what did the Padres do? They punish him. They fire him. They said, you didn't look good in the World Series. And what they should have said was, we haven't been here but once, and we didn't win that one, and let's build from that. Instead, they fired him. So what does he do? He goes up to San Francisco and he wins 3 World Series. Correct, Tom. In 7 years. He's a Hall of Fame coach. But if you looked at him and you said, well, we're not going to, let's get Barry Bonds to be the manager of the Padres, because what a great player he was, right? Would he have done anything? I mean, can you imagine Barry Bonds with that guy's ego, thinking about other players and supporting them? So it's sort of this perfect example of, he has to your 3 things, the trust, the care, and the competency. He has the competency. He played Major League Baseball for 9 years. You can't take that away from him. He wasn't a star, but he has the ability to build the trust. He has the ability to build the team. He has the ability to demonstrate that he cares about people, which we now know is really important. That's the kind of influence that you guys should be taking to your organizations and saying, let's think about who we're putting into management roles and not just promote the top architect or the top accounting guy or the top salesperson, because they're not naturally wired to go into leadership roles. It's a totally different responsibility.
I have that discussion a lot with people CEOs I work with and stuff.
think that
Right.
the one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the personal leadership philosophy. And I think that that ties in very tightly with the book, because it's a very personal journey that you take to describe to people what they can expect of you. And one of the things we make sure they get in there is the coaching and the development. We always say you have to at least, you know, tell them you're going to coach them and develop them. But it's like, I think that that's something that, Mark, I don't know if you're familiar with that process that we take our students through, of writing a one-page leadership philosophy to describe what are my values, how do I work, what do I expect of you, what can you expect of me, and what are our priorities. And they go through this cathartic process of laying out bare who they are and how they intend to lead. And it can be very motivational if in there they pull in some of the concepts you're talking about, which is making sure they understand that it's meant to communicate how much they're going to care and how much they really do want to take care of you. And in fact, we make them write it I, you, so that even if it's given out to 20 people, they know that they read it, that you're talking just to them. And I think that part of the book, that book also ties into a lot of what we teach and help people to understand how to better lead.
Do you have them write an obituary?
No.
No?
No, it's more this leadership philosophy, and we give them 6 points, but then they take it from there, and it's meant to be less than 1,000 words. And
I tried some time with a group, maybe with a group that you see the second time. If you ever have, if you're just training the same people, maybe not take the risk, but ask people to write, you know, imagining these people have long life ahead of them, right? The people that you're training. So, you know, it's into the distance, but how would you like to be remembered? What would you like what would you like your obituary to read? You know, and you know, Mark went to UCSD. No, that's not what I'm looking for. It's like, what were the values that Mark had that everybody saw in his life? What did he display? It's for the same reason that defining values is important. It gives them an end game of how they want to be remembered and how they want to.
We do an exercise where we tell people to tell us about the greatest coach you ever had. And we make them name it and why they were the greatest coach. And invariably, it's always the person that they spent time and made me feel that I was capable of much more.
Yep.
And then you challenge them and say, well, who would put you on that list?
Mm-hmm.
So go pick 5 people that work for you right now. And in 2 years, you want to be the person that if I ask them that question, and it's not hard, just they gave me time and they made me feel like they gave me the confidence that I could perform at a higher level than I was. And I think a lot of your book is about that. It's just give the person the time, make that connection, and really care about them. In a business perspective, it's to try and get peak performance from them, but it's also to let them know that you're trying to connect with them individually and make them be the best that they can.
So Tom, when I was an engineering manager in the oil industry, and I did all of my coaching and everything with my individuals, I always started with the exact same question. And they knew this in advance. So they always knew how these were going to start. And the question that I always ask them is, what's the most important thing we should be talking about right now? And when I started with that question, then they knew they had to bring stuff to the table, 1. And 2, they knew that this was really going to be about them, not about, you know, where you at in your status or anything like that. So if you're looking for a good way of transitioning that, that's the question that I use, is what's the most important thing we should be talking about right now? And then the conversations just went phenomenal and all over the place from there. But that's the technique that I also, you know, teach now in the LECs. But we've been going actually a little bit over here, and I'll kind of wrap this up a little bit. I really want to thank Mark. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to try to get a mailing address from you, because what we do is at Academy Leadership, we have these challenge coins, and initially they're done for your personal leadership philosophy, but we also have one that's, you know, we've been in business 20 years now. So I issue these particular ones to, you know, leaders of organizations who may not be going through the program, but have provided support to their team members, have provided good leadership for their programs. Really want them to understand, you know, how they're part of our team. So I'm going to mail this to you. If I get a mailing physical address from you, I'll drop it in the mail tomorrow. But these are what we have and we use within our organization, and they're a lot of fun. And I'll send you a little bit of a write up on the history behind them and some cool stories about it.
So very thoughtful. Thank you very much. I would like to just make a couple of closing comments.
Yeah,
One is Jim Emmerich. I don't know if he's still on, but has been just.
No, he had a hard stop. He had a hard stop.
Yeah, Jim had to leave.
Please pass this on, that he's just been an extraordinary supporter. And I did not know when I accepted your invitation that you had anything to do with him. So he sent me an email and said, did you realize when you said yes that, you know, I'm going to be a part of this? And I was like, no. So that was quite a nice surprise. This has been just a huge joy for me, and I'm honored that you read my book, and I'm honored by the reaction you had. I want to leave on good terms here and make sure that everybody understands that I wasn't intending to impugn the police or the police department. That was a discussion that we sort of went off the rails on. But it's important that I do think that if there were more heart in policing, then we wouldn't be so quick to judge them. We might have a greater sense that there was some display of, you know, acceptance of what's happening, and we're sorry, and we're going to get better, and the kinds of things that we do as humans to make things better. We're not seeing as much of that, and that's hard. And so that's really all I was going for, you know, not to, I'm a huge admirer of obviously the police, and they do an incredible job, but I just wanted to make sure that I didn't leave that hanging. So thank you so very much for this. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Well, good deal. Thanks a lot. And I guess, Tom, do we have the next book? What's our next book? And
I'll have to pull out the list. I thank you the fact that we didn't do at least 2 of these during the pandemic. I've gone off the rails on this. I'll push out another email to everyone, and we still have some books that are on that list from last year that went unread. And then I think we can bang one out late September or the first week of October. I think is a great idea.
Yeah.
And Mark, thanks again. And it really was, because we've picked some books that weren't that great, and yours was great. But I'll do that, Ken. Okay. I'll send out an email. We'll do a quick vote. We'll pick the book quickly, and we'll do the first or second week in October.
I'll give you a suggestion, Tom. You know, almost every guest that I've had on my podcast has written a book, and I would say they're not all great, but most of them are pretty great. And some of them really great. Like, if you haven't read Amy Edmondson's book on psychological safety, that would be one I would recommend. But if you go on my website, which is markccrowley.com, and go to the podcast, there's a description of what the person's there, what their message is, and you can see the book that they've written. You'll have the next 10 years books just by picking and, you know, choosing from there. And they're all like contemporary, you know, they're all like, most of these books have been written in the last 2 or 3 years, so they're state of the art. Some pretty great stuff.
Yeah, I wrote down the 2 that you'd recommended because I think I'd heard them, but they were not on our book list. So yeah, I'll go take a peek. In fact, I'll listen to a couple of these podcasts. But yeah, if you're looking for somebody to talk about personal leadership philosophies and the importance of being genuine and communicating with your folks, how you intend to lead, any one of us would be more than happy to join you and talk to you about that process.
Yeah, if you want to download it there, Mark, I dropped mine in the chat if you want to see an example of our personal leadership philosophy.
Yeah.
Before we
All right,
end,
thanks everybody.
All righty.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ken.
12 and a half hours.
and I'd like to say one thing, Mark. This has been really special having you as part of this book club. This is the most memorable book club meeting I've been to, and having you here is what made it so.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really honored by that. You know, it's a joy for me to talk about this stuff, and I appreciate the invitation, but that was a very lovely thing to say. So thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you.